Good morning. I will try to be brief, and if you know me, brief is not my brand, so we will see what we can do. I want to introduce the idea of cultural Marxism to you kind of with a historical and a little bit academic perspective. That's my real brand. So I'll cut out with all the jokes and all the fun stuff and get right to the terror. So the topic of the panel is what are the impacts of cultural Marxism in the United States and education in America today. I don't think that, if you're in this room, you probably are pretty aware of those. We have Marxists in the state houses. Our children can't read. Instead, they know how to be activists. They know how to complain about everything. They know how to show up at the state house and pretend to do some what the kids call cosplay, that they're all dying because they can't use their pronouns or something. They call them die-ins, that's real. So the impacts are overwhelmingly obvious to the people in this room. And I mean it, we literally, the Tennessee 3, for example, here in Tennessee, we have open, you know what this is? This isn't a friendly, power to the people symbol. This means, hi, I'm a Marxist and I'm here to ruin your society. You've probably seen it a lot on your kids' schoolwork, everywhere. That fist is the communist fist. Cultural Marxism is even too soft a word for that fist. That is the communist fist, and we see it everywhere. So it's infiltrated everything. Our children have had their educations hijacked. Like I said, they can't read. They can't do math. They can't do science. They don't know history. They know a twisted version of history that makes them hate their country. And so a simple summary that we can derive of what cultural Marxism is, and I'll put the legs under it afterwards, is that we're here to talk about the American dream, which we've all enjoyed, and it teaches people that the American dream is in fact an American nightmare. That's what cultural Marxism is designed to do. So where did cultural Marxism come from? It came from the frustrations of Marxists who realized that Karl Marx was wrong. In the 1920s, what had happened just before was that the Bolsheviks took over in Russia. Russia was a backwards peasant society. It was not an industrial capital. Marx had predicted the industrial capitals would go socialist by the march of history, by the inexorable wheels of social and cultural and economic transformation, and that turns out not to have happened. The Europeans would not pick up Marxism on an international scale. There were no Marxist revolutions that really succeeded. There was a short-lived one in Hungary that took over for a few months and got pushed back. Marxism was not taking root in Europe. It did not take root in America. There was lots of people that got involved, but it didn't do what happened in Russia. And this contradicted Marxist theory, so they had to sit down and try to figure out how Marx was wrong. And so an Italian, that was mentioned last night, an Italian Marxist theorist named Antonio Gramsci, sat down and he came up with a new model. He said that the problem is that Western culture produces something called cultural hegemony, which is like a force field that keeps Marxism out. And so if you want to be able to transform the West, you have to transform its cultural producing institutions. On down the track, half a century later, that came to be known as the Long March Through the Institutions. Antonio Gramsci named 5 key institutions that needed to be transformed, and those were religion, family, education, media, and law. And he put extra emphasis on education because he realized that virtually all of the rest are downstream from what happens in schools. Your doctors go to medical school, your lawyers go to law school, your media professionals go to journalist school or film school or some kind of school. Everybody goes to school to become a professional. Your children go to school and can come home and disrupt the family. Your pastors go to seminaries, which are a kind of school that they can subvert with liberation theology, for example, which is exactly what they did. In fact, liberation theology was the primary vehicle by which they got into the education system that's supposed to be secular. So this model allowed the idea that we have to infuse Marxist cultural values into our cultural producing and sustaining institutions to twist them from within on a long strategy that it would take generations to infiltrate, generations to subvert, and then all at once, at the end of the line, you could have a rupture. Welcome to the rupture. To mince no words, we are in the midst of a cultural revolution. And I think that you should have the courage to say that that's what's happening. We are in a cultural revolution just like what happened in China, the tactics are identical. So what I actually want to tell you, since I've got such limited time, is that there are three primary things that come down to what cultural Marxism is and how it's made an impact in America. And that these are very abstract things. The first one is a mechanism, the second one is a method, and the third one is a strategy. That's what cultural Marxism spent the better part of the 20th century developing in various different schools. Now, we'll come back to the strategy. That's where Antonio Gramsci came into play. Talk about the method first. The method actually was derived from a theorist that's famous for the Frankfurt School, also known as the Institute for Marxism, which became the Institute for Social Research so that nobody would know what it really was, which then took root particularly in Columbia University and disseminated through others, Brandeis, the UC system in California, and so on, when World War II started. And the second leader of the Frankfurt School's name was Max Horkheimer. And Max Horkheimer is famous for coming up with what's called the critical theory. Now, we shouldn't really talk about cultural Marxism here because Max Horkheimer wasn't technically a cultural Marxist. This is actually a vague term. As we heard last night, Wikipedia describes it strictly as a conspiracy theory. It doesn't exist. I am listed on the SPLC website as a hate person because I talk about the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. That there's a Marxist plan to subvert the United States and its children. So the kind of right name for this is actually Western Marxism, but it attacks cultural institutions, and that's why we call it cultural Marxism. But within that, there was a narrower vein because of this critical theory that was invented by Max Horkheimer, which is called critical Marxism. Turns out there are a lot of species of Marxism. It's a very prolific evolutionary tree of bad ideology. And what he said, what Horkheimer said was the point of developing the critical theory. He said, what we realized at the Institute for Social Research, what we realized was it's not possible to articulate a vision of an ideal society on the terms of the existing society. But what we can do, we cannot tell you what the good world looks like, but what we can do is criticize those aspects of the existing world that we wish to change. So the method of cultural Marxism is complaining. It is complaining relentlessly about everything. The word that actually got picked up later for this from a Brazilian Marxist educator named Paulo Freire is denounce. It is the denunciation of everything you don't like in the world. And look at your children. It's always somebody else's fault, it's always racism, it's always transphobia, and it always has to be denounced as awful and in immediate need of change. The way this method of complaining works, though, is much more sinister and subtle, deceptive with a capital D, to get biblical about it, than that. It's not just complaining and whining because we would stand up to that. It has to fool you. What Marxism does, always, is marries a truth to a lie. So it delivers you a lie wrapped in truth. Good way to think about that is if you're trying to give your dog a pill, you put it in some cheese or a hot dog. This is how they do. So here's an example. Let's say that I said something and somebody said, "You did a racism, James. You've offended me. You're a racist." We've probably heard some of that. Here's how this works. Maybe I truly did offend you. Maybe you're making it up, but maybe I really did. That's a truth. Here's a lie. James, you're a racist because you offended me. That's not true. There's no basis to draw the general conclusion from me having said something that landed wrong. So they wrap a lie in a truth. Here's another example, because they really like to do this with Christian values. I'll give you two versions of this example. Those kids on the other side of that razor wire are your neighbor, and you must love your neighbor. You see the truth, and did you see the lie? Isn't it clear? Or, you have to love your neighbor, so lock yourself in your house for 2 years and strap a thing to your face and take all the injections we tell you to, and don't take any other medicine because you have to love your neighbor. Close your church to love your neighbor. Here's another one. I said two. I'll give you a third one. I feel like I'm a girl today, so you have to affirm me. I don't know what your feelings are. Maybe your subjective feelings are truth. But now you have to affirm me is a lie. A truth married to a lie. And so our job is discernment. We have to be able to discern the truth, and we have to be able to discern the lie, and we have to be able to proclaim the truth and denounce the lie. Every time. And this takes skill. The easy part's over, Pastor. You have to learn some things. You have to learn how the lies are constructed. What you start to find with a little practices, most of them are on scripts. Most of them are the same pattern again and again. But you have to be able to pull the lie and the truth apart and expose the deception, at which point when people's eyes are open, they don't trust the deceiver. That's the method. They also constructed a mechanism. Now this mechanism primarily doesn't come from the cultural Marxists or the critical Marxists or the Western Marxists. Until about the 1970s, they weren't very good at it because they needed a different inspiration, somebody that actually knew how to make it work, and that person's name was Mao Zedong in China. And if you read from the 1960s and the 1970s, these cultural Marxists, Herbert Marcuse's name came up last night, he's one. Paulo Freire, the educator I just mentioned, he's one. If you read those guys, they say again and again and again how great the revolution in China is. Paulo Freire, in his famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he was outlining the Marxist method of education we now put in all of our schools, in a footnote in the first chapter says, this method derives from the very successful method of Mao with his revolution in China. So it's not like they kind of did the same thing Mao did. They copied Mao. They knew what Mao was doing. And what Mao did has a name that I just love. A friend of mine on social media came up with this. Hate craft. They teach hate craft. Mao separated the population into two groups. The people and the enemies of the people. Think about your life for the last few years. There are anti-racists, there are racists. There's nobody outside of that split. The people and the enemies of the people. There are allies and there are transphobes. There are the people who follow public health, and there are anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers who want to kill grandma. There are people who are voting for Hillary Clinton, and there are deplorables. There are people who are voting for Joe Biden, and there are people who ain't black. That was a joke. Making fun of the current highly competent commander-in-chief, if you didn't know what I was talking about. So, Maoist hatecraft works by separating the population into the people who see the glorious possibility of socialism, or equity, or diversity, or inclusion, or belonging, or, oh my gosh, sustainability. And then there are the enemies of the people who don't want that to happen. They're dragging their feet, they're resisting, they're counter-revolutionaries, they're conspiracy theorists, bad elements, domestic extremists, right-wingers. These are different categories, some of which I pulled from Mao, and some of which I pulled from our contemporary experience, and you couldn't tell which one was which because it's the same model. And here's how hatecraft works. The people who are on with the program are sold a bill of goods that everything's going to be great when we all do this. We have this terrible society, it's all locked down, nobody has an economy, nobody can do anything, but we can open up as soon as everybody gets their vaccine. But it's the fault of the people who are the enemies of the people that we can't do what we want to do. So they're holding us back. Mao called this formula unity, criticism, unity. We'll start with the desire for unity, then we'll criticize those elements that we want to change, and we'll arrive at a new unity on a new basis. His new basis was called socialist discipline. For us, our new discipline is a sustainable and inclusive future. The word that they use in the middle for criticizing is still criticizing, but it's also problematizing. But we just start with a place where everybody can feel like they belong. And we can't have a place where everybody feels like they belong because there's still systemic racism in this room, and so some people don't feel like they belong. So we have to find the systemic racists and transform them. I think the word in Chinese was ideologically remold them. Mao said it over and over again. You must continue your remolding. You must continue your remolding. It's DEI training. It's the equity lens. That's what they're having us do. So this gives rise to a mechanism by which they are able to mobilize large segments of the population against other segments of the population for divide and conquer. Divide et impera, DEI, in Latin at least. This is the Maoist mechanism that the cultural Marxists in the 1970s started to implement throughout the United States under the brand of identity politics. Identity politics was invented by Mao. It was adopted by the Combahee River Collective, which was a bunch of radical black feminists who inspired Kimberly Crenshaw to write it down in the first place. Angela Davis was a vector, Herbert Marcuse was a vector. That's how it works. So they also have a strategy, and that strategy is really the DEI strategy. It's cultural insurgency, which they borrowed from Mao, which is what was actually being referred to as the Long March to the Institutions. The Long March to the Institutions was this idea that we're going to go into the professions and we're going to take our ideology with us. But what's most important is the word that they didn't include with take our ideology with us is take our intolerant ideology with us. So here's how DEI really means. You think it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's not true. Equity is redistribution. It is to adjust shares to make participants more equal. That's, by definition, socialism. That's the actual definition of equity. They won't tell you that usually, explicitly. They put it in the middle of like 2,000 paragraphs, but it's there. What diversity means is not diversity. We all learned that. We listened to a great speech from the black face of white supremacy last night. What diversity means is politicize. It means to bring in people that are diverse to those values. People that are against American values, diverse to American values, you have to include them too. So then you politicize the environment, and inclusion actually means accommodation. You now have to accommodate those people, as they say, but that's not true. You have to accommodate their intolerant ideology. You have to start making changes to accommodate their ideology. And so this mechanism of the Long March to the Institutions is to go, whether from education or the churches or whatever, media, and go into every other possible institution down to individual families, down to individual lives, as big as the United States government, and get people in and use this insurgency method to transform it from within to what Antonio Gramsci called a counter-hegemony, a counter-state, a counter-family, an entirely new way of thinking that's ready for Marxism. And this is what they've done. Here's the mechanism so that you can learn to see this. This is how they take over an institution because it tells us where we have to apply our courage to stop them. And I wish I had 2 hours to really do this right for you guys with all the history. But first they come and they say, I demand access. You have to let somebody like me in. What they mean is a radical activist, but what they appeal to is their sex, their race, their sexuality, something like that. You have to let somebody like me in. Now, access is fine. You don't want to let in troublemakers, so the discernment matters, but at the same time, access is fine. The next step is where the inclusion happens. They demand accommodation for their ideology, which in Marxist terminology is called renormalization. Well, you had your meeting, but James got on the stage and said something that offended some of us. Women don't feel safe here. We have to change the policies on what's allowed to be said because women don't feel safe. No, a hyper-offendable feminist got mad because of her intolerant ideology. So then you have to redo your church, your institution, your school, your policies, your corporate, everything to accommodate not an individual, but a radical ideology that takes offense and complains about everything and denounces everything it wishes to change for its own purposes. The next step after that is they will demand a seat at the table. You need to let people like me into the power structure. After that, they're going to say, you have to put my friends at the table too. They're going to demand to run the table. And once they run the table, they're going to run the room. When they run the room, they're going to run it into the ground because Marxists know how to conquer, but they don't know how to manage. And this is how cultural Marxism has worked. And as Pastor said, we've seeded the ground for 50 or 60 years. Conservatives are really bad at this. I want you to start thinking, that you look in the mirror. We're mad about the civil rights law. How many conservative civil rights lawyers are there? That's leftist. There's basically zero. Why did civil rights law go all the way left? No conservative civil rights lawyers. Never put up the fight, and now we lost. And what's going on? Why did education go so far left? Well, that's liberal stuff. There shouldn't even be a Department of Education. Why did media go so far left? Well, media, that's a bastion for hippies. We gave it all away because we didn't want to fight in those domains. We've got to get into those fights. We've got to stand up and we've got to tell the truth. But I'm going to tell you, this is the last thing I'll say. And I echo the pastor a little bit. It's not quite a prayer. It's not going to be enough for us to tell the truth. We have to love the truth. And we have to fear the truth. If you don't love the truth, you don't have what it takes. Because if you love the truth, you're going to say it. If you don't, you're going to cower at the moment when it matters most. But if you love the truth, you don't care the cost. You don't care the risk. If I love the truth, I will look for the truth. I will seek the truth. I will say the truth. I will stand for the truth in difficult moments. When I see somebody else speaking the truth, I will stand with them because I love the truth for loving the truth. And you better fear the truth. Because if you don't fear the truth will assert itself sooner or later. And that's what it looks like when Marxists take over. The institution collapses, the country collapses, the food production system collapses, the medical system collapses, and people die by the hundreds of millions. This is what we're up against. We have a difficult time. We've given this war to our children. Shame on us. But we're not dead yet, so it's time to stand up, and it's time to love and assert the truth at every turn. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, one man telling the truth can bring down a tyranny. And it's true. So love the truth and proclaim the truth. Love it with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength. And thank you for letting me talk to you.